Picture the emptiest place you can imagine. Cracked earth stretching to the horizon. No rivers, no trees, no sound except wind moving over sand. Now imagine being dropped into that landscape 70,000 years ago with nothing but your own two hands and being told, survive here or die here. That is exactly what happened to entire groups of early humans. Not once, not by accident. Again and again for tens of thousands of years across some of the driest land on Earth. And somehow they didn't just survive. They raised children there. They passed down knowledge there. Entire cultures grew out of ground that looks, to modern eyes, like it could not support a single meal. So here is the question that should bother you more than it probably does. If the desert has almost no visible food, how did they know where to look? At first glance, this seems impossible. A desert looks finished. Empty. Like a landscape that has already given up everything it had to give. But that assumption says more about modern eyes than it does about the desert itself. Imagine walking across that same ground with someone who has lived there their entire life. And their parents before them, and their parents before that. They are not looking at empty sand, they are reading a page covered in information you don't know how to see. A slightly darker patch of soil, a bend in the ground where water used to run, a cluster of plants that only grows near something buried. To untrained eyes, none of it means anything. To them, it means everything. Archaeological evidence from desert-adapted groups, including research on the sand people of the Kalahari, shows something that upended how scientists thought about early survival. The desert was never actually empty. It only looked that way to people who didn't know what they were looking at. But recognizing signs is one thing. The real mystery is how those signs led to something as basic and as urgent as water. Every living thing needs water. That part isn't surprising. What's surprising is how far ancient humans were willing to go and how precisely they had to remember, just to find it. Picture a hidden spring, tucked behind a rock formation, invisible unless you already knew it was there. Not marked, not obvious, just known. Passed from an older generation to a younger one, the way you might tell someone which drawer the spare key is in, seasonal streams, shrinking oases, underground water close enough to the surface that certain plants could reach it with their roots, plants that, to a trained eye, acted like a signpost planted by nature itself. Where there was water, there was almost always something else nearby. Insects, birds, grazing animals passing through on some invisible schedule only they understood. Which meant water wasn't just water. It was the center of an entire hidden economy of survival, and knowing its locations meant knowing where every other resource would eventually show up. But water alone couldn't explain everything, because water doesn't leave footprints. And footprints, it turns out, were about to become one of the most powerful tools ancient humans ever had. Now picture this, a patch of sand, disturbed just slightly, a faint groove, a scattering of droppings, still fresh enough to matter. To most people, that's nothing. Just sand. To an experienced tracker, it's a sentence. It tells a story. What animal passed through, how long ago, how fast it was moving, and, critically, where it was probably headed next. This wasn't guesswork. It was a skill built over years, refined across generations, and in some communities, deliberately taught to children the way we might teach reading. Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer trackers have found that this kind of pattern reading pulls on some of the same cognitive processes involved in solving complex logical puzzles, turning small physical fragments into a coherent, predictive story, which means the desert wasn't just a place people wandered through hoping to get lucky. It was something closer to a puzzle, one that could be solved if you knew the language it was written in. But even that puzzle had another layer buried inside it, because meat was never the whole story. Here's where the story usually gets it wrong. Most retellings of ancient survival focus almost entirely on the hunt. Spears, chases, dramatic kills. But evidence from desert-adapted foraging groups tells a very different story. Much of daily survival didn't come from chasing animals at all. Imagine crouching beside a low, unremarkable shrub, digging just beneath the surface, and pulling out a root packed with the kind of water and calories a person could live on for a day. Imagine children trained to spot the exact shape of a fruit hidden inside a thorny bush, or the tiny disturbance in the sand that meant an egg was buried nearby. Seeds, tubers, nuts, insects. In many desert foraging societies studied by anthropologists, gathered plant foods provided the majority of daily calories. Not meat. This wasn't a backup plan, it was often the main plan. Reliable, predictable, and far less dangerous than confronting a large animal, which raises an uncomfortable question. If plants were so reliable, why did hunting matter at all? Because animals, it turns out, were solving the exact same problem humans were. Picture a herd of gazelle at dawn, moving in a slow, deliberate line toward a place hidden behind a low ridge. They aren't wandering randomly either. They're doing what every desert creature has to do, heading toward water on a schedule shaped by heat, safety, and habit. Early humans didn't need to search the entire desert for prey. They only needed to understand the routine, where animals drank, when, and how predictable that pattern was, day after day, season after season. This is where hunting and gathering stopped being two separate skills and became one unified system of reading the landscape. Water, plants, tracks, and animal behavior all connected, all pointing toward the same hidden map. But there was one more layer to that map, one that changed everything about how this knowledge had to be passed down. Here's the twist that made all of this far harder than it sounds. The desert wasn't static. A place that looked completely dead in one season could transform almost overnight after a single unexpected rain. Dormant seeds could sprout, dry riverbeds could briefly run again. Insects and animals could appear in places that had shown no sign of life for months, which meant knowledge couldn't just be about where, it had to be about when. Imagine trying to remember not just the location of every resource across an enormous shifting landscape, but the timing of each one. When the fruit ripened, when the animals migrated, when the rains were most likely to fall. This is precisely the kind of complex, layered knowledge that anthropologists argue could only be maintained through culture, through stories, through teaching, through generations passing down what individual memory alone could never hold on to. No single person could carry all of it, but a community could. So go back to the question we started with. If the desert has almost no visible food, how did they know where to look? They didn't stumble onto the answer. They built it. One generation at a time, one piece of remembered knowledge layered onto the last until an entire landscape that looked like nothing to outsiders became something closer to a map only they could read. Ancient humans didn't survive the desert because they were stronger than it. They survived because they learned how to read it, and then made sure no single person ever had to read it alone. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with. Because right now, surrounded by supermarkets and phones that can answer almost anything, most of us have lost the ability to read our own environment at all. The desert hasn't changed. We have.